I was elected. The judge was appointed.
Wow, somebody who thinks he's that powerful and has that much right to bury people's, democratic rights?
You better start asking yourself some questions about how the hell did this thing get in our Constitution.
I will trust that Ontarians will reflect on whether or not the provincial government made the right decision on overriding the Charter of Rights and Freedoms.
The Constitution and the Charter are fundamental institutions in Canada, and they should not be played with lightly.
Ontario Premier Doug Ford's decision to invoke the notwithstanding clause has prompted no end of political reaction. Much of the debate involves why and when Section 33 of the Charter should be used. Is there a bar that has to be met? What is the purpose of the clause if it's rarely used? And what are the repercussions for the country's judiciary if it is used more frequently? Time to hear from those who know about sitting in the Premier's chair. It's time for Premier's League. And joining me now, former BC Premier Christy Clark, Senior Advisor with Bennett Jones. She's joining us from Vancouver. In Calgary, Brad Wall, former Premier of Saskatchewan, now Special Advisor with Osler, Hoskin and Harcourt LLP. And in Montreal, former Quebec Premier Jean Charest, partner at McCarthy Tetro. Nice to see you all. Thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Pleasure.
Ms. Clark, I'm going to start with you. Do you agree with Premier Ford using the notwithstanding clause for a law to reduce the size, basically, of Toronto City Council?
Well, I support the use of the notwithstanding clause. The highest court in the land in our system is not the Supreme Court. It is the elected parliament. And the Section 33 was in the Constitution. We wouldn't have a Constitution without it, by the way, recommended by that incredible radical Peter Lougheed. It's there so that elected parliaments who are accountable can, when they see it's necessary, be a check on the courts. And that's what Section 33 is all about. I think it was an appropriate use of the power. And I actually think it's a good thing for Canada because we are in a moment where Canadians are looking around saying, hey, why can't anything get done? Well, Premier Ford has shown there is a way to find a way to get things done in spectacular fashion. And I think he did the right thing.
Okay, Mr. Wall, I have to ask, do you agree?
I do. It's been my experience, certainly was my experience in the province of Saskatchewan, that Section 33 played an important role in ensuring school choice. Just last year, a judge ruled on a question, a legal fight between our separate school board and the public board. The net result of the ruling would have been to risk the separate school system, to risk the ability of the government to provide some funding to private schools, to some faith-based schools, but significantly we wanted to ensure that parents had choice for their kids in terms of separate public and all of the options, and that the government had the option certainly and the authority to provide some financial support as well, some funding. And so we passed the School Choice Act in our province. We introduced it with Section 33 as a part of it. This is an important tool for premiers, as Christy has just canvassed quite effectively. I think it's, I've seen on my Twitter feed and some social media, I've seen people worried about the rule of law in light of what Premier Ford has done. Let's be very clear. Section 33 is part of the Constitution. And so the availability of the notwithstanding clause to premiers is very much a part of the rule of law. It's also part of a check and balance we have in terms of the judiciary and the elected legislatures in the Parliament of Canada.
I think, Mr. Charest, that perhaps some of the people who are at least raising concern over the rule of law are basing that concern on Premier Ford's statement that he is elected and the judge is appointed. And I'm wondering what you think about that, and then, of course, love for you to weigh in as well about what you think about his use of the Section 33 right now.
Well, in Quebec, as you'll know, Veshy, the notwithstanding clause has a long history. And I agree with both Christy and Brad that it's in our framework of our laws and the Constitution. So the rule of law is not brought into question here. It's all legal. It's all provided for. And it was done at the great request back in the early 90s of the premiers out west, Blakeney in Saskatchewan and Lyon in Manitoba, and Peter Lougheed. And Christy's quite right. We would not have the Constitution had that Section 33 not be written in. Now, that being said, the real issue becomes, is it justified in the circumstances, which is a separate question. And in my experience, and we've had to deal with this on language legislation on whether we should stop women or vote laws that says that people should not wear headwear or any religious symbols. And what I found is that if a government's going to invoke the notwithstanding clause, there has to be empirical evidence politically that justifies doing so, that it should not be done in an arbitrary way. And by the way, it's designed in that way so that if you do invoke it, there is an onus on your shoulders politically to demonstrate to the public that you're using the ultimate weapon to establish legislation, and you have to have a clear rationale for doing it.
That's a really interesting point. Let me pick up on that for you, Ms. Clark. Do you think in this case that bar has been met?
Well, I think it's up to the politicians to decide that. It's not a legal question. It's just a political question. And I mean, if I was to put myself in Premier Ford's shoes, I might have made a different decision about this. But I mean, I'm guessing he made the decision because there is never a good time to reform municipal government. And if he didn't do it now and had been dragged through the courts and waited 3 years, it will never happen. If it was a priority of his, I mean, there's, as Carolyn Mulroney said, I don't think there's ever a good time to do these things, and it isn't up to the court to decide when the time is. It is up to the politician, the premier, who's going to be held accountable for that, and Premier Charest is right. If the notwithstanding clause, there's a standard for using it, but it's a standard that's a political standard, and it's politicians that need to make those decisions about whether or not the politics of it is good or the politics of it is bad.
And to Jean's point, then the politicians will be held accountable by the people. The people will ultimately decide whether or not they believe a premier or a government has used the notwithstanding clause in a responsible and important way, and that's also how it should be.
What about the fear, Mr. Wall, though, that this sort of sets some kind of, I mean, and again expressed by Premier Ford's critics, that this perhaps sets some sort of new standard for using it in the future, and that we could see that bar that was defined by your colleagues, lowered in the future because of this?
Well, I don't think we have defined the bar. As Christy's just said, these are political decisions, and so the bar is set every time a decision like this is taken. I don't think it sets a precedent. I mean, obviously, this is a tool that's rarely used, and that's been its history since it was included in the Section 33. And so I think folks should relax a little bit in terms of worrying now that this is going to be a regular occurrence. I think that if there are judgments that are made that are subject to notwithstanding clauses, not all the sections, some of the sections of the Constitution are not subject to the clause, but to the extent that judges are ruling, one of the measures of accountability hardwired into our system, and I think it's a positive thing, is the accountability of the judiciary to the people, to the respective legislatures and the parliaments, but I'm not sure this is a precedent, and we're going to see now a torrent of the invocations of the clause.
What do you think about that, Mr. Charest?
Well, I agree with Brad. I mean, the clause, using the clause in itself is exceptional and unusual because it's so rarely done. And each premier has to determine whether or not the circumstances justify the using of the clause, and whether they want to carry the onus of using the clause, because there is a political onus in using it. And just to remind our listeners, it has a 5-year time limit. After 5 years, the clause, it has to be renewed. And so that also was part of the thinking of using this clause and making it difficult for politicians to use the clause, because they wanted to protect the fundamental rights that are enshrined in the Constitution. So it's going to be unusual. Whether this case, it's all very much a political call, Vashi. It all depends, and both Brad, Christy, and I are far away from downtown Toronto. For years, though, we've all heard how difficult it's been to manage the city of Toronto, and Premier Ford is making a very real judgment call in regards to how firm he wants to be in sending a signal that he wants change at City Council.
Okay,
and quickly, I think there is.
Okay, go ahead.
I think it's worth noting there is one other political consideration here that hasn't been noted much by the media. Premier Ford is answering this question that many people are asking: who's in charge in our country? Are the people that we elected to get things done and get them done quickly and efficiently so we can have things like Trans Mountain and other national projects go ahead? Or are there people who are unelected and ultimately far less accountable? Are they the ones that are in charge? And I think Doug Ford is actually answering that question in greater detail than he is even the question about the cost of government in Toronto.
Okay, we're going to pick up on that point on the other end of this break coming up. We'll be back with the Premier's League right after.